Hello, my friends. Welcome back to the Simple Low Carb Lifestyle Podcast. I am your host, Corey, the creative keto cook. And on past episodes, you've probably heard myself or other people in passing mention how lots of foods out there have oxalates and that oxalates are not good for the body. And if you're anything like me, you may go, well, what really is an oxalate? Why isn't it good for the body? And what do I do to, do something about that? So I reached out to Monique Attinger, and she is joining me today. So thanks for being here today.
Happy to be here, Corey.
As always, let's just start with your story. What got you into whether it was low carb to oxalates or oxalates to low carb, and go from there?
Well, it's kind of a little bit of both, but in fact, it's kind of an interesting story because I think one of the reasons why we don't know enough about oxalate is it tends to run kind of under the radar.
Mhm.
And so my story really starts with my young daughter. When she was about 2.5, she started to have these really nasty rashes, but they didn't look like a rash. They almost looked more like a chemical burn. And she was also having pain and inflammation, um, around the vulva. And so she was in the process of being potty trained, but she was very sore. And I kept thinking, this isn't right. Something's not right here. And I did not want her to be on a steroid cream because she
Yeah.
was 2 years old. And that just didn't make any sense to me. So we had a trusted naturopathic doctor who was a functional med kind of guy
Mhm.
that we saw. And so I went to him and I said, here's what she's got. It doesn't seem to respond to kind of the regular kind of treatment, like the pain that she's having around her vulva. I use, natural zinc creams and stuff. She's not more comfortable. The rash doesn't seem to respond to anything. I don't know what I'm dealing with, but it seems to come and go, and I'm not sure on what basis.
Mm.
And he asked me a bunch more questions. And then he said to me, I think your daughter has an oxalate problem.
Mhm.
And my response to him was, what's an oxalate?
Exactly.
Right? Like, who of us have ever heard of this thing before? And he didn't really give me a lot of information. What he did was give me a link to a website run by Susan Owens, who's one of the people who knew about oxalate at that time.
Mhm.
She's an independent biomedical researcher, I'd call her, and she knew about oxalate, and she was running a project called the Autism Oxalate Project.
Mhm.
So they had determined there was a link between oxalate and autism. I didn't have an autistic child. I
Right.
had a neurotypical child, but she was having these problems that this functional medicine guy had identified. And he was Defeat Autism Now protocol trained, and that's why he knew about oxalate
Mm.
at all.
Okay.
So it was kind of a bunch of, fortuitous accidents that kind of brought everybody together. So I started to do a bit of research. It was clear that we were going to have to do another new diet. I had been kind of low carb and gluten free for a while. And so my husband kind of went, not another diet.
Uh-huh.
And I said, it's not for me this time. It's not me just fooling around. It's somebody who said this is a problem for our daughter. So
Right.
I need to try. So he wasn't game to try. So I said, okay, I'll be the parent who models the new diet, right?
Yep.
He didn't want that on everybody's plate. And I knew that my daughter was old enough and aware enough and smart enough that she wasn't going to eat like that, if at least somebody
Yeah.
else
Somebody
wasn't.
else wasn't.
So I got on board. Very long story short, I started to manipulate this oxalate in our diet. And suddenly a whole host of health issues I'd been dealing with all started to improve all at the same time. And I
Mhm.
went, that can't be a coincidence.
Yep.
Because I was dealing with like poor exercise recovery. So if I did too much, I would just really have to struggle to kind of get energy back.
Mm.
I was dealing with kind of low grade muscle pain. I'm really suspicious I might have been on my way to a fibromyalgia kind of diagnosis, because between the low energy and the muscle pain, but in addition to that, I had very poor digestion. I was taking handfuls of digestive enzymes to get my food down. I had very poor sleep. Now, when you've had a couple of kids, you've probably, realized that you wake up a lot in the middle of the night, but it's like the kids started to sleep through and I was still
You were
waking
still
up in the
waking
middle
up.
of the night.
Yeah.
And nothing seemed to work there. So it was this very strange kind of insomnia where I would fall into bed dead and fall asleep in like almost seemed like seconds, but then I'd wake up wide awake in the middle of the night and not be able to go back to sleep.
Mm.
I had thyroid issues, which shortly after this I was diagnosed with a low thyroid. I had low cortisol. They had checked that. I was starting to have blood pressure irregularities. Like there was all these things.
Yep.
And for all of them to move basically together, I went, okay, gotcha. Something that nobody else has spotted. This is the thing. So I actually went back to the naturopathic doctor and said, I'm getting better on this oxalate diet. And he said, well, that's strange, because he would never have pegged me as an oxalate person.
Sure.
So those events really triggered this complete overhaul of our diet, but in the long run, a complete overhaul of what I was doing for work. Because before that, I was an IT project manager, doing consulting work. I was doing some writing for some websites on the side as, a way to get some of my, knowledge out into the web.
Right.
And like, while I'd always been a bit of a nutrition geek because I was just interested in it, this was not my full-time job.
Right.
This is now my full-time job. This is my gig. Because when I realized that my daughter could be diagnosed because her symptoms were distinctive and he knew they related to oxalate, but that I wouldn't be diagnosed because my symptoms were sort of systemic and diverse and it wouldn't be fitting the profile, all I could think of was how many other people out there have a constellation of symptoms or diagnoses where they're all being treated as independent things, because that's what was happening to me, and they're not getting at the root of it. And what if it's this thing, oxalate? So, it's been a very interesting journey, because I'd say that our understanding of oxalate as this kind of a problem where people could have multiple diagnoses, they could be diverse across the body, and yet might all be related to each other. This is a very new kind of idea, right? Because we tend to compartmentalize in medicine and, so I sometimes describe myself as the bleeding edge of understanding of oxalate as opposed to the leading edge, because I'm still dealing with a topic with my clients where they can ask me a question and I'll have to say, I don't know. I'll go into the research and find out for you. And so one thing from my background that's been very happy in that way is that I've got a master's in library and information science from way back there. And so I'm a really good researcher. And that means if somebody presents me with a question and I go looking for information on it, there's lots of times I'll be able to tell them more. And it's fascinating how many times I've found an oxalate connection where I hadn't known about one before. So I think truly we haven't paid attention to oxalate as an issue in the diet because we really thought the only way that it was a problem was if you turned up with kidney stones.
Right.
And obviously only certain people have that predisposition. But here am I, here to tell you, I went on a low oxalate diet and I've never had a kidney stone in my life, but boy, did it make a difference to my health. And I'd been low carb before that, but it really hadn't got me where I needed to go. I had lost some weight, but I couldn't get the rest of it off. Turned out a lot of the weight I was holding was kind of inflammatory. It wasn't really that somehow, it was just related to the amount of calories I was taking in, although I don't really believe that model anymore.
Mhm.
I do think it matters when and what you eat as much as anything else.
Yep.
But, that hadn't gotten me past joint pain or digestive issues or all these other things that were still on my plate. And nor had it let all of the weight shake off yet.
Mhm.
And so, here I am. I'm 60. Don't tell anybody. And
I'll
although
I'll edit that out for you.
we are on a podcast. I might have let out my secret, but I'm in better shape now than I probably have been since I was in my 30s.
Mhm.
And so the difference it made to reduce oxalate has been for me quite profound in terms of the amount of benefit I got from it. And so now that I'm adding other kind of higher power, low carb things like intermittent fasting and those kinds of things, honestly, it's just made such a huge difference. Just such a huge difference. The combination of the two has been amazing.
That's great to hear. So for everybody who's listening, what's an oxalate?
Oxalate's actually a chemical that we find in plant foods.
Mhm.
And it's actually very useful and important for the plant. And the plant's using it potentially in multiple ways. But one of the ways the plant uses it is to draw up minerals from the ground.
Mhm.
And the reason it works is that oxalate's a mineral chelator. And so, like other chelating agents, it's got a particular charge it's looking for, and oxalate's double negative charge. So it's looking for double positives, and I call this preferred dance partners. So oxalate goes out looking for its preferred dance partners, and no surprise, there are lots of the minerals that we need and lots of the minerals that plants need. That would include calcium, magnesium, copper, zinc, iron, like all of those occur in that double positive form. And so plants use it in order to be able to get what they need out of the soil. And very often, as particularly fruits become their ripest, oxalate will reduce. Why? They don't need to be pulling things out of the plant anymore, right? So we can see that plants are using it that way. The other way, though, that plants use oxalate is for defense. So lots of us in the low carb world have probably heard people say, animals can run, plants can't. And so animals use biochemical defenses, and oxalate's one of those. And if we look at a plant like rhubarb, great example. Rhubarb, if you plant a rhubarb in the back of your backyard, like many of my family and friends had back when I was a kid, nothing eats that rhubarb. The reason nothing eats that rhubarb is that there's enough oxalate in a rhubarb leaf that if a kid takes a bite of it and swallows it, that can kill them. So we don't eat the leaf, and anybody who's had rhubarb growing in their environment knows you're not supposed to eat the leaf. But even the stem of the rhubarb is no slouch when it comes to oxalate. So, some of the foods that we consider to be healthy, like rhubarb, like Swiss chard, like spinach, they are actually using oxalate to protect themselves from predation. And an insect attempting to eat the leaf of a rhubarb will actually end up with their mouths being damaged because of the amount of oxalate in crystalline form in that leaf.
Wow. And it kind of reminds me of, it's not plants or a defense purpose, but that in Death Valley, the water at the bottom of Death Valley is so salty and so mineral rich, the animals know, don't drink it. They know it's not healthy for them. And it's same with the plants with oxalates, like with the rhubarb. I've been thoroughly enjoying your Dirty Dozen on Twitter.
Yeah, that was a great idea that I got after seeing somebody retweet the environmental working group's Dirty Dozen. And I went, this is a great way to just give people some short, snappy information on some of the worst foods. And so, rhubarb is just featured in the Dirty Dozen.
I was reading that and I immediately thought of my dad. I'm like, well, should I send him this or not? But it's amazing how all these quote unquote healthy foods, spinach, Swiss chard, rhubarb, I believe almonds.
Almonds,
Almonds are a
yeah.
high offender. I'm sure we'll get into some other ones that I don't want to get into. Black pepper, for
Black pepper's
personal
not so
reasons,
bad.
as bad.
Not anywhere near.
Okay.
Yeah, no.
But I know some seasonings is, but you mentioned turmeric's one of the bad ones.
Turmeric is a really high one. So from a seasoning standpoint, the challenge is often that we like to use lots of it for lots of flavor,
Yep.
right? And so when you get to like a teaspoon of turmeric,
Mhm.
I believe we're at about 35 milligrams of oxalate, and that doesn't sound like a lot.
Right.
But the thing is, if you're eating this kind of stuff and you're having it every day, and maybe you're having, oh no, sorry, let me correct that. I just checked to be sure. It's about 50 milligrams of oxalate
Okay.
in 1 teaspoon of turmeric. And the challenge there is if you're having foods with these spices more than once a day, that adds up quickly.
Mm-hmm.
So let's just put it in context, because most people, I can throw numbers out there and they won't have any idea what that
Yeah.
means, right? So there is a group called the Vulvar Pain Foundation.
Mm-hmm.
The scientist in behind that group, originally his name was Clive Owens. His work and the work of some of the other people doing oxalate research pegged a low oxalate diet at 40 to 60 milligrams per day.
Okay.
And I think a lot of people can probably be very comfortably 60 to 100, which is called medium oxalate intake,
Mhm.
in a day. So
Okay.
that gives you some more room, right?
Yep.
But if you're having 1 teaspoon of spice and it's 50 milligrams, that's half your budget for the day.
Yep.
Um, and the problem with oxalate is not just how much you're eating, but also how much you're absorbing. If you've got leaky gut, that may be more, how vulnerable your systems are. Oxalate can be doing the same mineral chelation in your body that it does in the soil, but it's not good for us.
Right.
If oxalate comes in the bloodstream and finds an iron, cation,
Yep.
binds with it, and that leaves my body, I no longer have the benefit of that iron.
Yep.
And so we can be kind of subtly depleted, and we may not show up as a deficiency in a blood test, but we could be insufficient, right? It may not be that the blood test would show a bad thing, but we might be shortchanging our tissues a little bit, because the body will protect the levels in the bloodstream.
Mm-hmm.
So we can have that kind of mineral depletion in our bodies. Oxalate in its physical crystal form, and that can form inside the bloodstream. So if an ion of oxalate, which is not bound to anything, finds calcium in our bloodstream, well, that can precipitate out other places than the kidneys. So there's research which says we should be looking at arthritis as one of the places where people may have oxalate crystals in the joints. So that's it can drive that inflammation then physically as crystals.
Mm-hmm.
But it can also drive inflammation in our body biochemically. So if oxalate gets into a cell, at that point, it can drive the inflammasome, which is the mechanism in the cell that allows it to create inflammation. Mm-hmm. And you can end up with this situation where people have, inflammatory conditions, but they're aseptic. There's no bug driving them, and they're non-injurious. They didn't fall. They didn't have a surgery, right?
Yep.
But I think one of the biggest things that oxalate can be doing, kind of several dominoes down, so not just what oxalate does itself, but what it causes to happen as well. For some people, oxalate will irritate the mast cells to the point where they can start to get histamine type reactions. And that weird insomnia that I had, where you'd wake up in the middle of the night and be awake and not be able to go back to sleep.
Yep.
That can be related to histamine being released in the brain and being released too early. So in some cases that they're kind of subtle, because I took all kinds of different things to help me with sleep, but none of them worked because I wasn't getting at the thing that was driving it, which was actually histamine, and behind that was the oxalate. But one of the things that I find really a lot of people struggle with, if they've got a lot of oxalate load in their system, they've been eating a high oxalate diet for a long time, for instance, because the inflammation can be subtle, so we might not be consciously aware of it.
Yep.
But the immune system's aware of it. And the immune system then says, we have a problem, talks to the nervous system. What happens between those two is as follows. If the immune system has an infection or an injury, which is normally what inflammation is, it says to the nervous system, depress serotonin, depress dopamine. So the mood dysregulation and the anxiousness that can be driven by this low grade, under the radar inflammation going on in the body is oftentimes the thing that makes people, the most upset. Like if they could just get their state of mind back, that's what they want. So it really is quite pervasive, because I've just gone through all kinds of different systems that it can be involved in, right?
Yep.
And when it comes to getting rid of it, getting it out of your system, the kidneys are going to do the lion's share of the work. That's probably why we knew about it through kidney stones, right? But you can secrete it back into the gut, so it can be exiting with the stool. There's links between oxalate and asthma, if you can believe it. It can be coming out in the phlegm from the lungs.
Ouch.
It can be exiting through mucous membranes, so you can have it leaving through the sinuses and other mucous membranes. And you can even have it in the eyes, so it can be leaving in tears. Oh, and sweat and oils through your skin. I've had people actually keep a little crystal that they've had come out through the skin.
I've seen some pictures of, good sized crystals that people have excreted through their skin. It was like insanely painful. And it's like, that thing's about the size of a dime. It's amazing.
Well,
and
it can be eye-opening, right?
Yeah. And I know I've had it. If I do it, it's like usually my chest, and I can go like this and it feels like sandpaper. And you can grab a tiny piece and it's like, okay, well, I don't know what I ate because I didn't pay that close attention. But it's like, well, I know I ate something that caused the oxalates to dump, or I stopped eating it and my body was just excreting them.
Yes, because that's the other thing. People will say to me, well, I've eaten beets all my life.
Ooh.
Why am I having a problem now, right? And the thing is that, you've been eating them all your life and it's been slowly accumulating in your tissue. And at some point, something happened. It can be a trigger event, like what they would call a health insult. I had a fall, I had an injury, I had a surgery, I had a whatever. But sometimes those triggering events then start the body moving it. And that's when you notice, right? So they'll say, I was fine until X. And I'll say, you probably weren't fine. You were probably okay. And the symptoms weren't bad enough for you to consciously identify them. But the stuff may have been accumulating for decades.
Right. And it finally took that event, which sounds like more usually some sort of physical trauma of some kind, for the body to go, hey, let me dump this stuff out.
Or an illness. Sometimes an illness will do it too. Yeah. So people will say to me, I got a sinus infection and I had to take antibiotics. And the next thing I knew, all these things were happening. So it as a health insult, it can be almost anything, which, let me say it this way, disrupts the homeostasis of your body at that point. Right.
Okay. Makes sense. So I know that you mentioned how the oxalates are trying to find that double positive to bind, and it can leach the nutrients out of our body. But also, if my understanding correctly, that it also means if you're eating a high oxalate food, that makes the nutrients that are so healthy in the spinach, the Swiss chard, and everything else harder or impossible in some cases for us to absorb. That our bodies just really can't get to it because, hey, guess what? The oxalate's just going to pass it right on through the system.
Well, and that's one of the things it can be doing. The problem with oxalate is that anything that it's bound to in the plant that you're eating, because it doesn't occur in animal foods, like really, if it's a whole unprocessed animal food, it's not likely there's any oxalate at all in it. But when it comes to plant foods, some of them are overachievers. And we think of spinach as a great example of a highly beneficial, high mineral food.
Mm-hmm.
But there's actually a research link I can get you where scientists took turnip greens for the calcium content of the diet of rats, or they took spinach for the calcium content in the diet of rats. And we don't usually think of spinach as having calcium, but it's got a lot of calcium as well as a lot of iron, but there's a lot of it bound to oxalate.
Right.
So then what they did is take rats at age 21 days, and then they fed them either turnip greens, like all the rest of the diet was the same, but one got turnip greens for calcium, one got spinach for calcium. At the end of 90 days, they had some horrific outcomes, like bones not mineralizing properly, animals unable to reproduce, like, I'd have to go back and read all the details again, but those were the two that really stuck in my mind because of how catastrophic they can be, right? And if you think about it, in the natural world, your bones have to mineralize. You need good solid teeth to eat. And I know so many kids these days, they've got cavities, they've got issues, they've had to have work done already.
Yep.
Like, what if these really healthy diets are just not doing what we think they are because we're not keeping in mind that the nutrient is bound up with this, as I would call it, oxalate bomb, right? I think it's something that we haven't looked at. When we look at foods, we don't tend to look at the anti-nutrients. So scientists will give us this beautiful nutrient profile, tells us all the good things in a food, right? But never tells us about the stuff that's not so good that's in there, right? And if you do this anti-nutrient profile for something like spinach, what you'll find is high oxalate and a bunch of other bad guys, phytate and blah, blah, blah. And we really haven't been paying attention to that.
We don't pay attention to, unfortunately, the bioavailability of the vitamins and nutrients. They just say it's there. So to pick on spinach, but it offers all of these great minerals, nutrients and minerals, but that's great that they're there, but can your body extract it? Is it available to us? Whereas if I go eat myself a steak, it's darn near 100% bioavailable. We're designed to eat meat, whether people like it or not. And you're going to get all the nutrients out of that steak, whereas that spinach, you have to eat truckloads of it to really get. You would get so sick you'd probably die from it before you could actually eat enough to get
ever eat
what they think you would need.
And see, that's the thing. The thing about oxalate is that it is a human poison in sufficient dose, but under that threshold, until we have a certain amount of it built up in our system, we'll never notice any problem. And of course, if you've eaten something for 30 years, 40 years, in my case, now 60 years, you're not going to identify that as what's causing the problem. And so it's very challenging to really help people make that swing in terms of how they think about food, because the problem is sort of multiple. We're emotionally invested in some of our favorite foods, like your dad and his rhubarb, right? So it's not something that somebody's necessarily easily going to give up. If you've eaten it for your whole life, it's also embedded in maybe your family's customs or how you celebrate certain occasions. And so you have this social piece to food as well. And then, you've developed your taste buds over all that time period. So you like it, right? And then I'm saying to somebody, well, I can't really make rhubarb okay for you. And they don't like that message, right? There is some things you can do with a high oxalate food that you really like if it's not extremely high oxalate, like rhubarb's so bad. Like if somebody really loved rhubarb, like if your dad really loves rhubarb, I'd say like a little bit of rhubarb and strawberries, lots of strawberries.
Lots of strawberries, and
right?
then only once a year type thing.
Eat it once or twice and then, okay, I'm done for a while. because your body can get rid of oxalate over time. It might take some time for that to happen, but it can get rid of it. And for some foods, it can be really helpful if when you eat that food, you take a mineral supplement. So this whole business of being a mineral chelator can be used to our advantage. So let's say for some reason, I love chocolate, like most of us do.
Couldn't imagine. That was another one you posted recently, and I went, I don't know if I should show that one to my wife.
I know. But what I do is kind of a nuanced dance with oxalate, with the treat that I want to have, with staying low carb in my case, right? With the flavor. So what I'll do is this. There's a lovely little chocolate place that makes its own chocolate in my hometown where my mom lives. So I don't go there all the time. So I'll go there to visit her. We do a special thing. We go to the little chocolatier and we have one exquisite truffle. And I won't get a whole dark chocolate one. I might even go for a milk chocolate one because it's a little less in oxalate. And I'm probably going to get one that's got a cream center or caramel center because there's almost no oxalate in that.
Okay.
So I'm diluting some of that oxalate already with the part of it that doesn't have much. At the same time as I'm going to have my exquisite truffle, I'll probably have an espresso because it kind of heightens the flavor of the chocolate, right?
Yeah.
And then while I'm having this treat, I am probably going to take a calcium magnesium supplement. And that way, any free oxalate in my gut has a better chance of meeting a mineral in my gut. And once we have this bigger insoluble thing, I'm less likely to absorb it, and out it goes with the stool. So you can kind of use a combination of serving size, infrequency or intermittency, dilution. So if I'm going to have a high oxalate something, I'm going to dilute it with lots of something that's not high oxalate. And then taking a mineral supplement either just before or while I'm eating it. And with that, you can have some treats, right? The problem is for most of us is serving size. And in the last few months, I got caught with chocolate bits in ice cream. And I like ice cream, calcium, minerals. I thought I'm good, right? Yeah, I just overdid it.
So you got oxalates in with the chocolate ice cream. So the calcium's going to bind and not do any good anyway. Possibly.
Well, yeah. See, the problem was I just overdid the amount that I was having. So it was vanilla ice cream. No, it was coffee ice cream. It had these little dark chocolate bits in it. So if I'd had a small serving, I'd have been okay. But man, that was really good.
Yeah, it's ice cream.
It was low carb and it was rich and yummy. And yeah. So I've decided I can only have that in the house if we buy one package, everybody's home and everybody has some.
And it's gone.
And then it's gone. And then I can't do a bad thing. So yeah, I mean, even somebody like me who knows oxalate well got caught because my serving size was just a bit too much. So even though there's calcium in the dairy to help with the oxalate, a big enough serving, and I was going to absorb some of it.
And it's like with anything. I mean, as much as I know about low carb, I'll still have something I know that's not low carb on occasion. And you learn, you adjust, and you realize, hey, I goofed, and you move on. You don't, like a lot of people do, you say, that's it, I'm done, and start eating handfuls of almonds just to pick on something a lot of people like to eat.
That a lot of people eat. Yeah. And when people say chocolate covered almonds, I just cringe. Anyway, it's like both, just get it both ways. Anyway.
So is it okay, somebody's sitting there listening and say, okay, so now what do I do? Is it similar to low carbohydrate diet? You just limit your carbohydrates, you just limit your oxalates. Is there a number? I know you gave the low to medium, basically 40 to 100 milligrams a day. Does it work very similar in that respect, or do you need to almost get to the point of avoiding for a set period of time and slowly working stuff back in? What would that process be for somebody who's trying to?
Yeah, I hear you. And here's what I'd say. You have to be a bit nuanced with this. It's different than low carb because of how oxalate is stored in the body and also how oxalate leaves the body. So it would be really simple if oxalate just left the body in a small amount, steady stream, completely predictable. That would be beautiful.
Yeah.
That's not how it works.
Just like weight loss, it doesn't work like it's not a nice steady stream down.
No. So, but the problem with oxalate is it leaves in waves. So
Mhm.
you can have this big wave of oxalate and then it'll resolve, and then another big wave of oxalate into the bloodstream essentially, and then it resolves.
Mhm.
And in that process where you're having that big wave, you can end up with exacerbation of all the symptoms that you've got. So you can feel quite unwell. And it, in a way, it's somewhat similar to other poisons where you have to be as careful how you get them out as possible, because too fast can do too much damage to the organism.
Mhm.
So I don't necessarily want to scare anybody, but at the same time, I don't want anybody to dive in and just cut all the oxalate of their diet all at once, because I've had people who were clients of mine who didn't take my advice about going slowly,
Mhm.
started to remove all the oxalate out of their diet all at once, and ended
Mhm.
up in ER.
Ouch.
And that's not pretty, right?
Right.
And so really what you want to do is you want to kind of figure out where you are right now. So let's say,
Mhm.
and in the low carb world, this is easy. Say you're taking 500 milligrams in a day
Mhm.
because you're rotating between chard and spinach and you eat almonds, and it's really not that hard to be at that level,
Right.
right? Okay, so if I'm at 500 milligrams right now, maybe what I need to do is have one day at 250 and then go back up to 500, and then a
Mhm.
day at 250 and back up to 500. And so there can be this kind of nuanced dance that you do, because
Mhm.
going up and down like that kind of keeps the body paying attention. It doesn't just go, oh, this is the new homeostasis. They're just
Right.
eating 100 milligrams of oxalate a day, so I'm just going to start moving this fast,
Mhm.
right? But the other thing that people can do, and which is sometimes easier, is with my clients anyway, I'll establish them at a baseline that's a low oxalate diet, say about 60 milligrams a day. I try to get as close to that as possible,
Right.
leave as many options in as possible. And then they'll have a list of high oxalate add-ins to use. And I'll say to them, okay, every other day you eat 2 of those or you eat
Mhm.
3 of those to bounce your oxalate back up.
Mhm.
Or I might have them say, if they're at 500, I might have them say, okay, do the baseline 60, but we're going to have you have a serving of sweet potato every day.
Mhm.
And then we're going to slowly claw out the sweet potato.
Mhm.
But everything else in the diet has to look like the 60 milligrams.
Right.
So for many people, that's easier, because then we identify, oh, maybe they're having sweet potato and green beans or something as their high oxalate foods. So
Mhm.
something where there's at least some nutrient for the oxalate that they're going to get.
Right.
And then we claw those out. And if they're having a bad day, instead of just one serving of sweet potato, they might have 2 because they
Mhm.
feel off. And sometimes pushing up that oxalate works to shut down dumping temporarily.
Mhm.
So there's some kind of signaling between the gut and the rest of the body. It has not been characterized. This is all a hypothesis.
Sure.
But what I've seen repeatedly on support groups with myself and with my clients is if somebody's started to dump too intensively, if we bump their oxalate up for a couple of days high enough,
Mhm.
their body will stop doing it. They'll get a bit of a break. It may still be leaving the body, but not with that level of intensity.
Sure.
So they get a breather. And this up and down kind of thing, where maybe I've got 1 or 2 days high, a day or 2 low, 1 or 2
Mhm.
high, a day or 2 low, can be a really good way to handle it, to get it
So it
moving, but not
right.
too aggressively, right?
So it gets you that, it gets the body to know I need to get rid of this, but again, like you said, it's not we're just letting it all go because hey, I don't need this anymore. So it'll just lessen the pain, basically.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so there's what I call it, the dance, or
Mhm.
sometimes I refer to it with other metaphors, but it's essentially, if I get up on the floor to do a waltz, I'm going to make it from one side of the room to the other, but I might go around in circles a lot on the way there, right?
Right.
So I have to be prepared for this nuance sort of manipulating of my diet and persistence, so that
Mhm.
I give enough time for it to leave. Um, if you're not really sick, and I do have clients who are very unwell where we have to do really complex things, lots of stuff with supplements and things. But if you're not really sick, but you've identified that oxalate's your problem. Like say somebody's come to me with kidney stones, but they have no other diagnoses, right?
Right.
They're probably going to be stopped dumping somewhere in the range of 18 months to 2 years. So it's a marathon. It's not a sprint,
Mm,
right? Now, that doesn't mean you're dumping constantly through that time period.
right.
The worst of it's usually in the first 6 months while you're getting rid of kind of the most intensively of
Hmm.
what's in there. Because some of it can actually be in the bones and those don't turn over quickly. So
Right.
what happens is you get these waves, you get these waves, you get these waves, but then you get a wave and then you have a long break and then you get a wave.
Hmm.
And so the periods in which your body's sort of more aggressively moving oxalate get shorter and the breaks between them get
Longer.
longer. And so for me, by the time I was about 18 months out, I was essentially normal.
Hmm.
And I had come into this with low cortisol, low thyroid, digestive problems, all those things that I was mentioning before.
Right.
And at that point, I could depend on my energy. I could schedule my day. I could, turn up for things when I committed to them. I
Hmm.
didn't have the kinds of health problems that I'd had before
Hmm.
that. So I think that's a good news story. Um, and a lot of people will say to me, well, can I put high oxalate foods back in my diet? And my answer to that would be, I don't think so.
Well, that'd be like an alcoholic asking, "Can I add alcohol back to my diet?" It's not a good idea.
It's very much like that. And interesting that you should use that analogy because there are some people in the background that I talk with who are, parts of think tank groups and stuff who think that there could be a mild addictive quality to oxalate. That might be
Hmm.
part of the reason why people just really go in whole hog on them. And, and it is very much the same thing. If you absorbed it once, how do you think you're not going to absorb it again?
Yeah. You're going to absorb it again, but there's no way around it. But we have that mental, like you said, there maybe there's a relationship to whatever it is, family, an event, a holiday, and so well, I don't want to give that up. And like I've talked about so many times, you got to change your mindset. Is your health worth? And this might be a tough one for some people, but is your health worth dark chocolate? Some people would say no, the dark chocolate is better than my health, but what's more important to you, the pain, the grief, and the aggravation, or same with going low carb? What's more important to you? You're gonna be sick, sick and tired and fat and overweight, and you can't play with your kids, or the pizza?
Yep.
Uh,
I totally hear you, Corey. And that's why I was a little embarrassed when I got caught by dark chocolate ice cream myself. But that's also why I went, okay, I know what this is.
yep,
And I ended up feeling wretched for 2 or 3 weeks, which was really not worth it. And I went, okay, right? Small enough serving, I'll be fine.
hmm,
We just don't bring more than one package of this into the house. Like sometimes you just have to manage that way,
yeah,
right? Because we are human.
hmm,
And, when I got caught was Christmas time, and my kids have birthdays that bookend Christmas.
ooh,
And so I wanted to have appropriate, good nutrient, low carb, and
yep,
maybe a little bit of something that they like, which they don't normally get,
yeah,
like chocolate in their ice cream.
hmm,
Um, but yeah, we always have to keep in mind it's better a small serving of something than too much.
yeah,
And how easily can you get back on the horse, right? So I trained myself a long time ago with low carb.
yes,
If I had a bad day, I just got back on the horse. I just got
yep,
back on the horse. I just got back on the horse. And after a while I didn't fall off anymore,
yep,
right? So some of it is building the habits
yeah,
and potentially learning the substitutes, right?
hmm,
So somebody who really loves chocolate, I've been playing with something called Maya nut,
hmm,
and it's almost a chocolate cappuccino kind of flavor. Very nice. Not exact, but very nice. And so, maybe there's a way for you to get some of the flavor that you like
right,
in an appropriate kind of serving,
hmm,
right? Or sometimes I'll make really low carb, really low oxalate muffins, coconut flour, egg.
Right.
They're perfect, right? 1, 2, 3 chocolate chips on the top. That's
Yep.
not going to kill anybody, right?
Mm-hmm.
So some of it is this kind of thing. But we've had to like cease to keep nuts in the house because none of us can stay away from them.
Yep.
So if I buy nuts for something, I buy only what I need.
And that's
I
it.
use it in something that's going to dilute that oxalate, and that's it. Yeah.
Now, are nuts in general a high offender? So I know almonds is the one that I always see focused on, but
Yeah.
is it just nuts? End of story.
Pretty much. There's a few exceptions.
Okay.
You can't have a ton of them, but macadamia nuts turn out to be a good one. So if you have, a little, not a whole handful, but maybe a little bit in the bottom of your
Palm.
hand.
Yeah.
Yeah. An ounce or less,
Mhm.
you're fine.
Okay.
And there's a new nut that I've just learned about, and I'm involved with this lovely retired professor who does oxalate testing. So,
Mhm.
we get these things tested, and they're called baru nuts,
Okay.
Baru, and those are only 1.7 milligrams in an ounce.
So really, really low.
Really, really low. And I don't eat a lot of nuts anymore, so I had a couple, but I made my son try them. And he
Mhm.
said they taste like a cross between an almond and a peanut. Like they're quite lovely.
That's good.
So I think there are some things that you can have. Pumpkin
Mhm.
seeds are very low, watermelon seeds are very low. So if you want something that's got some crunch, and
Right.
you don't necessarily have to go to a nut.
Mhm.
Um, and it's very much serving size with some of
Right.
them. If you get a small enough amount.
But yeah, but the hard part is it's that handful turns into half the jar, and
Yes.
you're out of luck. And
Yes.
I'll back up just a little. I like the fact that, like you said, with your, well, we'll just say ice cream binge, that you paid attention to your body. It's something I tell people with low carb. It's like if you do something, you go, I shouldn't have done that. Listen, how do you feel? Like you said, you feel horrible for 3 weeks, and you went, and it wasn't worth it.
Yeah.
And I've done that a couple times in the last several years where I've had a meal that night. It's not even, I mean, it could be just within hours. It's like, oh, my back is hurting. Why my elbow hurts? Why does my, oh yeah, I like a moron went and ate X, Y, and Z like I used to. And paying attention to your body when it says, hey, guess what? That wasn't fun, is a good reminder to stick to it.
Absolutely. Like pay attention to the signals, right?
Yep, exactly.
I do know people who can, have the odd treat like that and they don't seem to suffer the same way.
Yeah.
It's really not worth it for me. And I actually stay much lower than even the 40 milligrams of the low range, because I just feel better that way.
Right.
And so that's been a great learning for me as well, because, I always thought, well, as long as we're in this 60 to 80, I kind of went to the low end of medium, and that seems to be working really well for us. And it did. Um, but now I have just that little bit much more energy, a little bit more vitality. My sleep is deeper. Like there's these little subtle things that were well worth paying attention to.
Yeah. It makes me think of a lot of people that have, I was low carb for years and felt great, but then I went carnivore, and they got rid of, in some cases, some of those oxalates more than likely. But
More
they're
than
like, I
likely.
have so much more energy. I feel so much better. I'm sleeping. It's like, I thought I was great then. And same going from a standard American diet to a low carb diet. Same thing with the oxalates. Sometimes as you continue to bring them down, you may be surprised at how you feel overall, which is great.
Yeah, I was really surprised what a difference it made. I'm very close to fully carnivore now.
Mhm.
And again, it's just been a pay attention to what's working,
Mm.
and just really surprising.
Yeah. And now I don't know if you mentioned it or not, but can oxalates also cause, like, I guess basically muscle pain, persistent muscle pain? I know you were saying you were having a hard time recovering, but I'm thinking like specific, hey, my back always hurts type thing. I know everything else I'm eating is good. I'm walking, I'm exercising, but there's this gnawing pain. Is that something that could be an oxalate related that you know of, or is this one of those I don't know, I need to research type things like you mentioned?
Well, I am following the research on it for sure, because I don't have the smoking gun.
Yep.
Okay. So it's not like some things like the arthritis piece where I could say, I've
Right.
got the smoking gun. I've seen this research. It's finding crystals in joints
Mm,
and, saying if you've got arthritis and it's not responding to other things, check for this. Right.
okay.
So I don't have that with muscle pain, but there does appear to be a fibromyalgia link to
Hmm.
oxalate. And of course, fibromyalgia is a lot of muscle pain is, a big part of it. It's not all of it, but it's a big part of it.
Yeah.
But what I'd say is we do know that oxalate can be stored at the site of former injuries.
Hmm.
And so one of the things that happened for me as I was lowering oxalate is I'd had a lot of falls when I was a kid. I did ice skating.
Oh yeah.
And ice doesn't give at all.
No.
You're going to absorb all the impact, right?
Yep.
So I noticed that sometimes when I was having dumping symptoms, and I know we're being a bit vague here about what
Hmm.
dumping symptoms are, but very often they're related to inflammatory processes. Very
Hmm.
often they can be related to old injuries. So I would get pain in my low back and it would
Hmm.
come out of the blue. Like I hadn't been lifting anything. I hadn't been, something that would have triggered my low back.
Right.
And I don't get those kinds of issues anymore.
Hmm.
So I have to assume at this point that the oxalate was stored in those places where it had those injuries.
Right.
And what I can tell you is anecdotally, and I'm one of the administrators of Trying Low Oxalates group
Hmm.
on Facebook, and we're also on Groups.io. 36,000 people
Just a
on the
couple.
Facebook group. Yeah. And so we hear a lot, right? Because there's a lot of people on the group.
Yep.
And one of the things I can tell you is that a lot of folks report that where they've had injuries, they will have pain, and they
Hmm.
do report muscle pain. And it's usually in muscles that are getting a lot of work,
Hmm.
um, or where you've had a lot of falls, like low back for a lot of
Right.
us. So I think muscle pain's a real thing with oxalate. I just don't have a smoking gun in terms of research that somebody's done where I can go, look, there it is.
Okay. Uh, that's good to know. So yeah, what would I mean? Somebody that's listening to all this, going, "What in the world? Where do I start?"
Yeah. Here's what I'd say: slow, gentle, take your time. And we talked about oxalate being a mineral chelator. One of the best things you can do while you lower some of your oxalate, right? So let's say you're an everyday spinach eater. So let's say you go to every other day, and then you do that for 2 or 3 weeks. And then you go every 3 days. You do that for 2 or 3 weeks and you just sort of fade it out of your diet. And
Right.
then if you're also eating sweet potato, right?
Hmm.
Then you start working at it. Like bring it out slowly.
Hmm.
But at the same time, try some of the great support things that we know are foundational. And taking a mineral supplement would be a great example.
Right.
So take a calcium, magnesium, or take a multi-mineral, get your electrolytes,
Hmm.
oxalate can also take sodium and potassium out. It just takes two of them at a time,
Hmm.
right? So you really want to make sure that you're supporting your minerals in your body as much as possible. And magnesium is so key to our energy levels. I tend to focus more on magnesium than some of the others, but can be a good catch to take some zinc, take some selenium, take some iron, right?
Right.
If you start that while you lower oxalate,
Hmm.
then if oxalate's freed up from the tissues and it goes and finds its little mineral dance partner and goes out with it, if you're continually supporting that mineral level, then you'll be able to weather that better, right? And interestingly enough, one of the best things you can do for yourself in terms of oxalate is Epsom salts baths.
Hmm.
And that's partially because you're getting the oxalate.
Right.
But the other thing that, or not the oxalate,
The
the
minerals.
magnesium,
Yeah.
right? But the other thing I didn't talk about that oxalate can actually do is some of our cell transporters are tailor-made, if you will, for certain substances,
Hmm.
right? So if you've got a cell transporter that goes out into the bloodstream to pick up sulfate, that cell transporter in most cases will also move oxalate.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason for that is our bodies have always been able to handle getting out a certain amount of oxalate. We
Yep.
get some as a byproduct from our metabolism, not a lot, but a little
Mhm.
bit, right? And of course, we've probably eaten plant foods forever,
Yeah.
right? To one degree or another. So our body knows how to get it out. So these transporters that move sulfate in
Mm-hmm.
tend to move oxalate out of the
Okay.
cell. If oxalate's plentiful in the bloodstream, the cell transporter can end up picking up oxalate instead of sulfate and
Mm-hmm.
pulling it into the cell. And so one of our biggest consumers in the body of sulfate is the liver.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can get kind of this fat digestion compromise. So when you hear about people talking about carnivore adaptation and they can't handle fat, I'm
Right.
really suspicious that they've got some oxalate in their liver and their liver is kind of struggling to do this fat
Yeah.
digestion piece, right? But that gets me back to the Epsom salts, because Epsom salts is providing you with magnesium sulfate.
Mm-hmm.
And instead of a big bang dose, like you take a capsule or whatever, the capsule dissolves and this big bang dose hits the gut.
Yep.
You've got this gentle and very sort of small diffusing dose, but all over on the body,
Mhm.
right? And so one of the best things that people can do when they think they have an oxalate problem is start with Epsom salts baths.
Hmm.
And if you're sick or feel more fragile, start with less, because
Mm-hmm.
too much of a good thing can throw you off too.
Yeah.
Like as soon as we hit that homeostasis, we can throw ourselves off in a big way.
Mm-hmm.
So if you haven't done Epsom salts baths ever before, or don't do them frequently, maybe you start at like a half a cup, or maybe even less than that. I've had people start with a tablespoon. It just depends on how fragile the person is.
Sure.
But your target is to get up to 2 cups in a bath.
Mm-hmm.
And honestly, I don't even measure it anymore. I take the bottle, I pour it. And I still do them, not because I've still got a lot of oxalate in my system, but because there's such good support for your body if that sulfate's available, because the liver may be the biggest consumer of it, but other organs are using it too. Your
Right.
kidneys are using it, right? The sulfate gets used all over.
Mm-hmm.
So that simple tactic, which also promotes relaxation, which for many people, if they're stressed, stress can make this whole oxalate problem worse somehow.
Right.
Because I see it repeatedly with clients. Again, don't have a smoking gun, but I would just want to give people a heads up, right?
Yep.
Anything you do to manage stress is going to make it easier. You're almost going to be able to handle this excretion better.
Yep.
And then anything you can do to give your body this sort of all over gentle support, it's a great way to go. So Epsom salts baths are, I mean, they sound like, can I take a pill? Isn't there something easier? Why do I have to lay in a tub? You know, I get all kinds of complaints from clients, but they're actually one of the best darn things you can do.
How do you get much easier than laying in a tub? I mean,
Some people don't want to put the time in a tub, like,
yeah.
you know.
It's not just, it's like, it's not hard, and it's not a bad way to end your day either.
No, it's a great way to end your day. But what I'd say is if you're going to do it and you
Mhm.
haven't done it for a while, the first time you do it on a weekend
Mhm.
and do it early.
Okay.
Because the additional magnesium, some people can actually find they have more energy.
Right.
And so you want the day to work it off if that happens for you.
Yep.
It doesn't happen for everybody. Some people, they have their first bath, they're relaxed, and that's great. Just go do them in the evening all the time now.
Yep.
But you know, for some, if they haven't done them for a while, this might be a good way to go.
Okay.
And then the other thing you can do, if you want to just encourage its movement out a little bit.
Mhm.
So my clients, I'll sometimes tell them they have a spa schedule. So you can go to a sauna. A little bit of sweating, not too much. Don't overstress your system, and don't do it all the time. Like,
Right.
unless you're used to doing saunas, don't do them all the time. So I'll
Mhm.
tell people, we're going to do the wave. We're going
Right.
to do day 1 sauna, day 2 Epsom salts, day 3 rest, maybe day
Mhm.
1 sauna, and like do it like that. Because that way you can encourage it to leave, but you're not overstimulating it, because then you can get back into that problem. It's leaving the body too rapidly.
Yep.
And it's just as toxic going out as it was going in. We may not have noticed it on the way in, but you know, oxalate, sufficient amount, you can be messed up and it can kill. So I don't think we should really play with that too aggressively. Like,
Right.
let's just do things gently, right?
It's not like low carb where you can rip the Band-Aid off and start. You may get a 2-week keto flu type thing where you just feel until your body kicks in. It's good to know that oxalates aren't quite that way. You want
No,
to, like
you
you said,
want to,
you got to be in it for the long haul.
you got to be in it for the long haul.
Yep.
And you really want to, like, gentle but persistent. Like,
Yeah.
I did it the wrong way. I would
Mhm.
not recommend my way to anyone. It was good that I kept making mistakes, or it would have been worse. So they tell me that oxalate's bad. I figure out what oxalate is. I realize how much of we're eating it, and I just nosedive down.
Yeah.
So the good news for me was I did keep making mistakes. I was using spices that were too high and didn't realize it. So I was doing some of this intermittency.
You were doing that,
chocolate
what you
going up and
recommend. Yeah.
down, and I just didn't know it. Yeah.
Yep. Is there a good resource to get a list of, okay, the high oxalate foods?
If you just want to dodge a bullet, like you don't really have a problem right now and you're just going to avoid the highest oxalate foods, I did an article on celiac.com. I'll have to get you the link.
Yeah.
But if they look for Monique Attinger on celiac.com, there's a couple of articles there where I talk about how to reduce oxalate. So I'll give them a little bit more information. But there's a list in my first article on how to reduce oxalate of all the highest oxalate foods.
Good.
So it's not just a dozen, it's a good big list, but it'll help them, be able to pull that out of their diet.
Okay.
And then the second article that I did for celiac.com is low oxalate superfoods. Essentially, it's how to get your superfoods, but not get all the oxalate.
Yep.
And so for all these other superfoods that people are fascinated by, I've got an alternative that they can go to.
Take advantage of. So yeah, we'll put all those in the show notes for everybody listening going, well, where do I find that? Well, go to simplelowcarblifestyle.com and go to this episode once it's been released, and you'll see them. So what is one simple tip that you would offer somebody that, well, normally I ask this question as considering starting the simple low carb lifestyle, but we're discussing oxalates in particular. So what would be one simple tip you'd offer somebody who really thinks, hey, I might have an oxalate problem, to get them going?
The easiest things would be drop one extremely high oxalate food every couple of weeks and start taking more minerals, and like a good Cal Mag with some, and maybe a trace mineral formulation and an electrolyte. And those things fit in really well with going low carb as well. You have to manage your electrolytes. There's things there that you need to do, right? So I think those would probably be my first tips.
Okay, that sounds good. Yeah, because that fits with what you've been saying, how you slowly titrate yourself out of it and not just jump into the deep end. And now going to low carb in particular, your favorite low carb recipe?
My favorite low carb recipe has to be my low carb brownies. And I know your people are now going to want that recipe, aren't they?
Probably, yeah.
I'd be willing to share it. Coconut flour, kind of a nuanced way of getting the chocolate taste without using too much cocoa. And my kids love them. So if they pass the kid test, I'm thinking they're pretty good.
We got a birthday in August, so we may have to use that.
Hey, I would recommend it. And actually I tend to use like a whipping, like a whipped frosting that uses cream cheese and whipping cream. And that's become our favorite for for birthdays. Whatever we make, we ice with that. So
you can't go wrong with a good cream cheese frosting.
Not in my opinion. No.
I'll do that. You don't even need the cake, in my opinion, but we'll leave that alone.
I have been known to just have icing.
It was just cleaning off the spoon, honest.
Yeah, that was it.
And where can people find you if they want to reach out to you, get some more information, they need some coaching? Where can they find you on the wonderful world of the web?
They can find me at lowoxcoach.com, and it's OX stands for oxalate. I had
Mhm.
somebody ask me once if I was reducing oxen meat in people's diets. I am not. And I do call I am a certified holistic nutritionist, but I call myself a coach because it's not a sprint. It is a
Right.
marathon. And so it's really about helping people make the changes they need to make, but know that they might go away for 6 months, they might come back, they need a little
Right.
tweak. We have to tack in the direction of where they want to go.
Yeah, it's you have to, as a friend of mine put it, you got to start on that trajectory and continue on that trajectory, and there'll be times along the way where, wait a minute, what am I doing? And you have to readjust and continue on that path.
Well, it's much like sailing if you've ever sailed.
Hmm.
Um, I've only done it a few times. I love it. But you have to know the quality of the craft.
Yeah.
You need to know the weather,
Yep.
right? You need to know the direction that the wind's coming from. So
Hmm.
all of these things will affect us. And that's also why I don't tell my clients how frequently they have to see me, or nor do I have a standard program, because what comes up in your life might be different than what's come up in somebody else's life.
Yep.
And it's really about just getting you where you need to get to.
Right. That's good. That's a good point too. That for people to understand if they start this, it's again that back to that. It's not linear. You may get whacked with it one day and be fine for a while, then you'll get hit with it again. So something to keep in mind is for anyone out there that's like, oh, I do have an oxalate problem.
Yeah.
Remember, this is going to take time.
Yeah.
Just like the simple low carb lifestyle. It took you decades to put on all that weight and to get unhealthy. It's going to take time and years to lose the weight, get healthy. It's the same thing with trying to reverse an oxalate problem. It's going to take you time.
And sometimes you need new tools. I mean,
Yes.
my low carb life is so different now
Yes.
than it was when I first did it. I was not ready for intermittent fasting when I first did
Yep.
it, but it's been a great ad, right?
Yep.
I was not ready for, really trying to think about a very low carb kind of approach, and
Hmm.
I didn't like the idea of higher fat. And so like it's been a real journey sort of
Yep.
trying these tools and then figure out which ones work and which ones didn't for
Yeah.
me.
It
And it really is about what works
for you.
for you,
Yep.
right? Because the thing is that your low carb might look different than my low carb, but as long as we're both getting where we want to go, it's all
That's
good,
all that
right?
matters. So that's why I say constantly, everybody and everybody is different. Yeah, you just because it worked for me doesn't mean it's going to work for you. Everyone's going to work a little bit differently.
Yeah.
So, well, thanks for joining me today. I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation, and I know that everyone else is going to enjoy listening to it. So, thanks for being here.
Oh, thank you very much, Corey. I was just so thrilled to be invited and just so happy to get the message out.
All right. We will see you again on Twitter, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
Thanks.